Hey guys, and welcome back to Battlefront Updates and some more Rogue One, a Star Wars story content. This video will contain spoilers for the movie, so if you haven't watched it yet, make sure to click away. In this video I wanted to talk about how Rogue One actually makes A New Hope into a better movie, and not just A New Hope, the whole original trilogy actually. And there are a couple of things to note here, and there was obviously tons and tons of links to all the old movies from Rogue One, but if we're just talking about improving the actual movie and the plot of it, there's a couple of major things we need to talk about. First one simply being the fact that the Death Star was a inside job, something people have been joking about for a very long time. This explains why something so small as an exhaust port could be enough to destroy the whole Death Star, because it wasn't just someone doing a really clumsy mistake when building the Death Star, but it was actually planned. But as a counter question to that, I know a lot of people will ask, well, how didn't they find it? And well, I think the Rogue One explains that very well as well, because when Galen Erso was building the Death Star, Krennic didn't really have any doubts on him. He thought he was doing the job just fine, and it wasn't until the events in Rogue One that he started doubting the actual Death Star. And since A New Hope plays out merely days, if not hours, after Rogue One, you can understand how little time they had to look for this error. So as soon as that seed of doubt was planted into the Imperial minds, they started investigating the Death Star, and that thing is huge. So when someone who actually built the Death Star and know exactly how it works puts a really small thing in there that can blow up the whole Death Star, it's not something you will find very easily. Something to note there though is that the Rebels did find that error before the Imperials. This could be because the Rebels got a head start. They knew it had to do with the reactor, and they also knew that this weakness actually consisted, whereas the Imperials didn't really know that for sure, but was simply guessing. And they knew that the whole Death Star was working because they obviously used it both on Scarif and on Jeddah. But if you move on, I think this doesn't just explain why they were able to so easily blow up the first Death Star, but it also explains why they built the second one. Because if there's something some people have been annoyed by, including myself, is that the Empire or the First Order keeps building massive destructive weapons that can then be easily blown up. And this at least explains the second Death Star, because after the destruction of the first Death Star, the Imperials probably found out that it was an inside job, especially considering that right before it blew up, one of Tarkin's advisors told him that they actually located a weakness. And because they knew this was an inside job, it really makes sense for them to create another one, because the first Death Star wasn't a failure as an actual project. It did exactly what the Emperor wanted, except for the fact that Galen sabotaged it. So for them to create a second Death Star, this time making sure that there are no insiders, really does make a lot of sense, although they obviously failed with that as well. But it kind of explains why they even made it second Death Star in the first place, because if the first Death Star was actually blown up due to Imperial issues, well, it sort of did, but I mean through actual building faults, then it wouldn't have made as much sense to build a second one. And something that I just thought was a bit interesting is how the Senate actually worked around this time. Because in A New Hope, pretty much all we get to hear is that the Emperor has disbanded the Senate after some of the other, I think it was generals, complained that the Senate will never authorize this and so on. But in Rogue One we get to hear how they talk about the Senate and how they need to keep them in the dark. And even after shooting at Jeddah and probably even Scarif, they tried to keep it a secret and just say that it was a mining accident and so on. And this really shows the power of the Senate. Even the Emperor with all his power cannot control the whole galaxy with the Empire, but he needs to have the political power in the Senate. And it wasn't until he was 100% sure that the Death Star was working that he disbanded the Senate and decided to simply rule the galaxy in fear. And this is something that I found very interesting, although I know some people don't like the politics in Star Wars. I thought it was interesting to get that sort of gap and some more information about the Senate, and not just hear that it was disbanded right away. Rogue One also gives Tarkin's character a lot more depth, because as we could see in the movie, he was a little bit doubtful of the Death Star and especially of Krennic. And it wasn't until the end, and especially after the test at Jeddah, that Tarkin realized that this is actually pretty good. I should take control over this, which he then did. And he put in a lot of trust into this weapon. And that kind of explains why he refused to leave the Death Star in A New Hope, even after the technicians actually spotted a weakness that could be used. These are just some of the major things that Rogue One has affected in terms of A New Hope. Obviously it gave a lot more depth to many characters in the original movie, but if we're just talking about the major things that Rogue One actually improved, I think this is probably one of them, because the exhaust port of the first Death Star has been something that has been seen a little bit as a plot hole, and Rogue One really patches that up and explains nicely why that even happened in the first place. Please let me know in the comments below if there was anything else that you think Rogue One changed. It doesn't have to be A New Hope, it could be any of the future movies, the prequels, or even the Rebel series, which I thought was greatly improved by seeing Rogue One as well. I just like the fact that they make movies that make the other movies better, if that makes sense, while still being a really good movie by itself. If you're interested in more Rogue One content, make sure to click that subscribe button. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, may the Force be with you.